We must stand together!
No. This ends now.
How could you?
It is done.
The white dress was the worst part. Not the silence that swallowed the entire pack hall. Not the 200 pairs of eyes drilling into the back of my skull like they were waiting for me to shatter. Not even the way his jaw tightened when he turned to face me at that altar. Like looking at me was something he had to endure. It was the dress. I had chosen it myself. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I had stood in front of the mirror in my small cottage at the edge of Ashvale territory, hands pressed flat against my stomach where a secret I hadn't yet found the words to speak was quietly, miraculously blooming, and I had thought, this is the dress I will wear when everything becomes real. Now, standing at the altar beneath the stone arch wrapped in silver moonflowers, the same hands pressed against the same stomach for an entirely different reason, I understood that something was becoming real. Just not what I had imagined. Alpha Kale Duskmore, 6 feet 4 inches of dark hair, silver eyes, and a jaw carved from something cold and unforgiving, looked at me the way you look at a problem you've already decided how to solve. He didn't waver. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even have the decency to look sorry. His voice when it came was low and deliberate. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this. Who had made his peace with it long before I had any idea there was something to make peace with. I, Alpha Kale Duskmore, reject you, Elara Cole, as my mate, my Luna, and my equal. Before this pack, before these witnesses, before the moon goddess herself. I reject you. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. And then the silence came, absolute, suffocating, and somehow louder than anything I had ever heard in my life. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. I stood there in my white dress with 200 wolves watching me and I did not make a single sound. I pressed my hands harder against my stomach, breathed through the pain that split through the center of my chest like an axe finding a fault line, and I lifted my chin. Because what Kale Duskmore didn't know, what no one in that hall knew, was that I wasn't standing there alone. 3 heartbeats. Tiny, fierce, impossibly strong. His heartbeats. And I would burn the entire world down before I let him know what he had just walked away from. This is the story of a rejection that rewrote everything. A woman who became something fiercer than she ever imagined she could be. And an alpha who would spend years learning the price of a single unforgivable moment of cowardice. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Chapter 1 Inch. Let me take you back, just 3 hours before the ceremony. Because you need to understand something about Kale Duskmore before you understand what he did. You need to understand why, when he looked at me from across a crowded training field 8 months ago with those impossible silver eyes, something inside me had gone completely, catastrophically still. Wolves know their mates the way the sky knows the moon. Not by logic. Not by choice. By something older and deeper than either. A recognition that lives in the marrow, in the instinct, in the part of you that existed before language. The moment I caught his scent, cedar and cold rain and something darker underneath like iron and night soil, my wolf had simply stopped. She went quiet in a way I had never experienced. Not afraid. Not cautious. Certain. I had told myself to be careful. I was Elara Cole, daughter of a mid-ranking Ashvale pack warrior and a mother who had left when I was 6. I had no political standing, no family alliances, no bloodline that made me a natural choice for the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. The kind of woman alphas married for love and stories. The kind they passed over in real life. But Kale had looked at me like I was the only fixed point in a spinning world. For 7 months he had been relentless. Not in the overwhelming territorial way some alpha males could be, pressing close, marking space, making a woman feel like prey in the guise of pursuit. No. Kale had been patient. Achingly so. He would find excuses to cross my path. Would linger at the edge of conversations just to hear me finish a thought. He brought me wild verbena from the eastern ridge because I had mentioned once that it was my favorite scent after rain. He had kissed me for the first time under a half moon in late autumn, both of us breathless and stunned by it, and he had pulled back and looked at me like I was something he didn't know how to hold without being afraid of breaking. You are the only thing I've wanted, he had said, his voice rough. That I was never supposed to have. I should have asked him what he meant by that. I didn't. Foolish girl in a white dress. I had been so full of joy, so full of the impossible golden warmth of being chosen, that I had let the shadow of those words pass through me without catching. By the time I stood at that altar, it was too late to ask anything at all. The pack hall was the oldest structure in Ashvale territory, black stone walls, vaulted ceiling threaded with hanging lanterns, the altar carved from a single slab of moon-pale granite. It had witnessed 2 centuries of matings, of bonds sworn and sealed, of alphas and lunas joined before the goddess in the old way. I had dreamed of standing here. I arrived first, escorted by Orla, my closest friend and the pack's head healer, who squeezed my hand so tight at the entrance that I felt her pulse against my wrist like a second heartbeat. "You look like starlight," she whispered. I had smiled. I had been glowing. 6 weeks into the pregnancy, barely showing, the secret sitting warm and impossible in my chest. I had planned to tell Kale tonight, after the bonding ceremony, in the quiet of our first night as a mated pair. I had imagined his face. The shock first, then the slow dawning wonder of it. I had imagined him laughing, that rare, real laugh he saved for moments when no one was watching. The hall filled. The lanterns were lit. The elder took his place at the altar. And Kale walked in. He didn't look at me right away. That was the first thing I noticed. He walked down the center aisle with his beta, Vance, 1 step behind him, and his eyes were forward, fixed on some middle distance, his expression arranged into something careful and deliberate. My wolf stirred uneasily. "Something's wrong," she said, in the wordless way wolves communicated with their human halves. "Something has already been decided." I told her to be quiet. He reached the altar. He turned to face me. And for one suspended, crystalline moment, I looked into those silver eyes and searched for the man who had pressed wild verbena into my hands in the dark. He wasn't there. What I found instead was a stranger. Composed. Resolved. And beneath it all, the one thing that made my heart drop straight through the floor. Guilt. Not love. Not fear. Guilt. The specific, dull guilt of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the aftermath. "Ilara." His voice was low. Not a greeting. Not a beginning. An ending. "Don't," I whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "Kale. Whatever you're about to do, don't." Something moved across his face. A fracture. So small and so fast that I might have imagined it. Then it was gone. And he spoke the words that unraveled every single thing I thought I knew about my life. After, there was a particular quality to the silence. The pack watched me. 200 wolves, some with their hands over their mouths, some stone still, all of them waiting to see what Ilara Cole would do when her mate rejected her in front of everyone who had ever known her name. I breathed. Once. Twice. I looked at Kale for a long moment, not with hatred, not yet. With something more final than that. With the specific bone-deep grief of watching something die that you loved more than you knew. Then I set my small bouquet of white moonflowers on the altar. Gently. Like a burial offering. I turned around. And I walked out of the hall. I did not run. My back was straight, my chin was up, my hands were steady at my sides. Every step was deliberate. Every step was a message. I am not broken. I am leaving. There is a difference. It was only when I reached the tree line, only when the darkness of the Ashvale forest closed around me like water around a stone, that I stopped walking. That I pressed both hands against my stomach. That I let myself feel the full, catastrophic weight of what had just happened. 3 pulses. Small and fierce against my palms. His children. Conceived in love, in trust, in the warmth of a man who had told me I was the only thing he'd ever wanted, and then stood at an altar in front of his entire pack and chose otherwise. Thought about going back. I thought about turning around and walking back through those stone doors and telling them all. Watching his face when he understood what he had discarded. But then, what would that make him? A man who stayed for duty instead of love? A father who looked at 3 children and saw an obligation he had been trapped into? Oh, my sons. And somehow in that moment I already knew they were sons. Would never, ever be someone's obligation. They would never be a burden. They would never grow up watching their father look at their mother with that specific dull guilt of a man who had chosen wrongly and had to live with the consequences. They would be chosen. Fully, freely, and without condition. Or not at all. I wiped my face. I breathed in the cold night air. I pressed my fingers one last time against my stomach in silent promise. "I've got you," I told them. "All 3 of you. I've got you and I am not going to fall apart." Then I went back to my cottage, packed everything I owned into 2 bags. And disappeared. What Ilara couldn't know, standing in that dark forest making promises to 3 lives barely larger than whispers, was that the moment she walked out of that hall, something inside Cale Duskmore had gone very, very quiet. Not relief. Not resolution. Devastation. But by then, it was far too late for that to matter. Chapter 2. There is a particular kind of strength that no one teaches you. It isn't the strength of battles won or enemies faced down or wounds survived. It's quieter than all of that, and far more brutal. It's the strength of waking up every single morning in a life that no longer resembles anything you planned, and choosing, deliberately, consciously, painfully, to build something from the rubble anyway. I learned that strength in the back of a bus heading north with 2 bags at my feet, a secret in my body and absolutely nothing else to my name. I had one destination in mind. Caerwyn Sanctuary. Most wolves in the Northern Territories knew of it the way they knew of things that existed at the edges of respectability. Acknowledged, occasionally useful, never quite spoken of in polite company. A neutral zone. A city built on unclaimed land between 4 territorial borders, governed not by any single alpha but by a council of elders, healers and rogue wolves who had, for one reason or another, chosen sovereignty over pack loyalty. Some called it a refuge. Some called it a last resort. My mother's sister, Aunt Nerys, had lived there for 11 years. She had left Ashvale before I was old enough to remember her clearly, choosing Caerwyn's freedom over a pack structure that had never quite fit the shape of her. We had written letters. Sparse ones, careful ones, the kind exchanged between 2 people who care about each other but have never quite learned how to say so plainly. I had her address memorized. I had never used it. He'll know. The bus ride took 9 hours. I spent most of it with my forehead against the cold window, watching the darkness outside blur into pre-dawn gray, then into pale morning, then into the flat silver light of a November day that had decided against warmth. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My wolf was too unsettled, circling, restless, caught between grief and something else she couldn't name. Fury, I think. Under everything else there was fury. But she was keeping it banked, saving it. Wolves were patient hunters when they needed to be. We'll need it later, she told me quietly. I know, I told her back. At the 7th hour, somewhere between the old territorial markers and the Caerwyn outer boundary, I felt it. The mate bond, or what remained of it after Cale's rejection, gave one last terrible pull. Like a hand reaching through water. Like something alive refusing to accept that it had been ended. I pressed my fingers to my sternum. Breathed through it. Let it wash over me without letting it pull me under. You don't have a mate, I told myself. You have 3 children. That is more than enough. That is everything. By the time the bus crossed the Caerwyn boundary line, the pull had faded to a dull ache I could almost pretend was just hunger. Almost. Nerys opened her door at 6 in the morning to find me on her steps with 2 bags, shadowed eyes, and a white dress I hadn't bothered to change out of because somewhere between packing and leaving I had simply forgotten that I was still wearing it. She took one look at me. Then she stepped aside and said, "Come in and sit down. I'll put the kettle on." No dramatics. No questions. No gasping at the dress or the hour or the expression on my face that I could only imagine looked something like a person who had survived a building collapse and wasn't entirely sure yet which bones were broken. Just tea. And a chair. And Nerys, small and sharp-eyed and fierce in the way that women who have built their lives entirely by themselves tend to be fierce, setting a mug in front of me and sitting across the table and waiting. I wrapped both hands around the mug. I said, "I need to stay for a while." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm pregnant." She didn't flinch. Her eyes dropped to my stomach, still completely flat under the ruined dress, and then came back up to my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not pity. Something steadier than that. "How far?" she asked. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. Alpha-blooded. I nodded once. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the Caerwyn streets were beginning to wake. The distant sound of early market stalls, a child somewhere laughing, the particular morning noise of a place that belonged to no one and therefore felt, paradoxically, like it could belong to anyone. "Right," Nerys said finally. She stood up. Topped off my tea. "Then we'd better get started." What followed was the most grueling and quietly extraordinary 8 months of my life. Nerys's cottage was small. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as an apothecary workroom, a garden that grew more medicinal herbs than flowers, but she made room without complaint and without ceremony. That was Nerys's way. She didn't make a production of kindness. She simply extended it, practically and without fanfare, and expected you to do the same when your turn came. I worked. That was what saved me, I think. The simple, relentless occupation of being useful. Kerwin's sanctuary clinic needed assistance, and Nares, who was one of its senior healers, brought me in within my first week. I organized supplies. I assisted with herbal preparations. I learned things about wolf physiology and pack medicine that my Ashvale education had never covered. The sanctuary's approach to healing was older, more nuanced, shaped by the reality of treating wolves with no pack bond to anchor their recovery. It was harder than belonging to a pack in some ways. And in others, it was a liberation I hadn't known I needed. By the third month, I had stopped waking up reaching for a mate bond that wasn't there. By the fourth, I had stopped dreaming about silver eyes and the specific unbearable way Kale's voice had sounded when he said my name like it was an ending. By the fifth, I had started dreaming about what was coming instead. 3 alpha-blooded pups. The sanctuary's head midwife, a warm, unflappable she-wolf named Tamsin who had attended over 300 wolf births and claimed to be unshockable, confirmed the triplets at my 12-week scan with an expression that was fighting very hard not to be delighted. 3, she said for the third time, staring at the imaging results. 3 distinct heartbeats. All strong. All showing early alpha resonance markers, which is extremely unusual. Their father was a strong alpha, I said neutrally. Tamsin looked at me, looked back at the screen, made a small professional sound that contained, I suspected, an entire editorial's worth of opinion. Right, she said. Well, we'll want to monitor you closely. I won't pretend the pregnancy was easy. Triple alpha pups pushed against the limits of even a healthy she-wolf's endurance. By the 7th month I was enormous and exhausted, my wolf cycling between fierce protective instinct and a bone-deep fatigue that made even crossing a room feel like an accomplishment worth recording. Nares fed me things that tasted terrible and explained unapologetically that nutrition was more important than palatability. Tamsin checked in twice weekly. Orla, my friend, my Ashvale pack sister, had found me through a letter I'd sent 2 months after arriving, and had begun sending packages. Dried herbs, soft wool blankets, tiny hand-sewn garments she had made herself, because Orla was the kind of woman who processed worry through her hands. She never mentioned Kale in her letters. I never asked her to. They came on a Thursday night in late July, during a thunderstorm that felt, in retrospect, entirely appropriate. 19 hours of labor. Tamsin and Nares and 2 assistant healers, all working with the focused calm of people who had prepared for precisely this. Lightning outside the clinic windows. Rain so heavy it sounded like the sky was trying to say something urgent. The first one came at 11:47 p.m. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for my heart to stop entirely, and then he announced himself to the world with a sound of such magnificent, indignant fury that Tamsin laughed out loud and said, "Oh, this one has opinions." I named him Cain. After the star, not the story. A fixed point in the northern sky, unwavering, unignorable. Cain, who would grow up to be the most stubborn, the most controlled, the most devastatingly perceptive of the 3. The second came 17 minutes later, quieter, calmer, arriving into the world with his eyes already open, looking around with an expression of grave, ancient curiosity that made the assistant healer whisper "Moon Goddess" under her breath. Brighter. Because he came into the world like he was already going somewhere and nothing was going to stand in his way. The third took his time. 40 more minutes after Ryder. Long enough that I was exhausted beyond language, running on nothing but wolf instinct and a ferocious refusal to stop. Long enough that Tamsin's calm professional face had developed a careful edge that she was doing her best to hide from me. And then finally, with the thunder rattling the clinic windows one last time before fading, he arrived. Silent. So terrifyingly so for 5 entire seconds while Tamsin worked with swift, practiced hands and I heard my own pulse in my ears like a drum. And then he breathed. A small, perfect, furious breath. And then he opened his eyes. Silver. Just like his father's. Zale, I thought immediately before I had even fully processed that he was breathing, that he was here, that all 3 of them were here and breathing and real. Zale. The old tongue's word for light returned after darkness. It felt right. Nares placed him on my chest, warm and small and vibrating with quiet life, and I held all 3 of them. Somehow impossibly held all 3, and felt the most profound silence I have ever known settle over me. Not emptiness. Completeness. As I thought. Whatever else happens. Whatever else I lost or was taken from me or gave away foolishly in the name of love. This is why. The years pass the way years do when you are too busy surviving to watch them go. Quickly in memory, endlessly in the living of them. Kerwin became home. Genuinely, not reluctantly. Nere's cottage became ours. Extended by 2 rooms and a garden renovation and the slow accumulation of 3 small lives worth of chaos. I rose through the sanctuary clinic from assistant to senior healer, specializing in pack bond injuries and mate bond trauma, which was perhaps the most elegantly ironic career development possible. I became known. Respected. The she-wolf healer with the 3 silver-eyed sons who ran the clinic's bond therapy program and who did not, under any circumstances, discuss her own history. Cain, Ryder, and Zale grew into themselves with a speed that was both exhilarating and alarming. By 3, they were completing each other's sentences and conducting what could only be described as coordinated chaos operations that no single adult was equipped to anticipate. By 4, they had developed the kind of pack instinct that usually took years of communal living to establish. Moving together, communicating in the subtle wolf shorthand of posture and scent and near silent sound. They were silver-eyed, dark-haired, broad-shouldered for their age, and possessed of an alpha presence that made grown wolves step back without quite knowing why. Kale's sons. Down to their bones. I loved them so ferociously it was sometimes indistinguishable from fear. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days after I had walked out of the Ashvale Pack Hall in a white dress, when Zale climbed into my lap as I was reading through a patient file, wrapped his small arms around my neck, and pressed his face against my jaw. "Mama," he said in that particular tone of his, thoughtful and serious and already halfway to a conclusion before the question was asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Cain and Ryder were arguing about something in the garden with the passionate conviction of people who have strong feelings and no information. Nere's was making dinner, the cottage warm with the smell of rosemary and wood smoke. "Do we have a daddy?" Zale asked. The file in my hand went still. I had known this question was coming. I had been preparing for it in the abstract way you prepare for things you cannot bear to think about concretely for at least 2 years. I had planned what I would say. Something true but measured. Something that honored their right to know without weaponizing them with a grief that wasn't theirs to carry. I opened my mouth, and then stopped. Because from outside, through the open kitchen window, carried on the cold October wind, a scent. Cedar and cold rain and something darker underneath. Iron and night soil and the specific indelible scent of a wolf I had loved more than I had ever loved anything except the 3 lives he had no idea he'd left behind. Duskmore. Ashvale. My body went absolutely, completely still. "Mama." Zale pulled back to look at my face, his silver eyes, his father's eyes, wide and questioning. "Are you okay?" I set him gently off my lap. I stood up. "Stay here with Nere's," I said quietly. "Do not come outside." And I walked to the door. Chapter 3. The night air hit me like a warning. Cold and sharp, carrying that scent with unmistakable clarity now that I was outside and unshielded by the warm layers of rosemary and wood smoke from Nere's kitchen. I stood on the cottage doorstep and let it wash over me fully, cataloging every note the way a healer catalogs symptoms, methodically without panic, looking for the complete picture before drawing any conclusions. Cedar. Cold rain. Not kale. The relief that moved through me was so sudden and so complete that my knees actually softened for a moment before I locked them back into place. Not kale. Different enough in the bass notes that my wolf could distinguish it clearly now that the initial shock had passed. Younger. Less weathered. The same bloodline. Unmistakably the same bloodline, but not him. I stepped off the doorstep onto the garden path. He was standing at my gate. Tall, dark-haired, silver-eyed in the way all Duskmore wolves were silver-eyed, like the moon had decided to take up permanent residence behind their irises. He was perhaps 24-25, still carrying the last traces of youth in the line of his jaw, dressed in dark traveling clothes with the faint territorial markings of Ashvale worn in the small silver pin at his collar. He had his hands raised. Slightly. The universal wolf gesture for "I am not here to fight." And he was staring at me with an expression of complete, unguarded shock. I didn't move from my side of the gate. "Who are you?" He blinked. Refocused. "Elara Cole?" I asked who you were first. A beat. Then, with something that might have been a rueful almost smile if the circumstances had been even remotely different. Declan Duskmore. Cale's younger brother. I looked at him for a long moment. I had known Cale had a younger brother. Had known it the way you know background details about someone's life. Present, noted, never quite brought to the foreground. Declan had been 17 when I left Ashvale. A junior pack member still in training. I had never met him directly. You're a long way from Ashvale territory, I said. Yes. He lowered his hands slowly. I was tracking rogue activity near the Cairwyn boundary. 3 reports of unregistered wolves crossing the eastern perimeter. It's routine patrol work I wasn't looking for. He stopped. His eyes had moved past my shoulder. I turned before I could stop myself. Kane was standing in the cottage doorway. He had absolutely not stayed with Nares as instructed. Of course he hadn't. He was 5 years old and possessed of an authority-to-compliance ratio that remained, after 5 years of active parenting, stubbornly inverted. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his silver eyes fixed on the stranger at the gate with an expression of such cool, assessing suspicion that it was momentarily difficult to remember he was wearing pajamas with small wolves printed on them. Behind him, because they were constitutionally incapable of allowing Kane to do anything alone, Ryder and Zale pressed forward to see 3 silver-eyed faces. 3 dark-haired boys with their father's jaw and their father's bone structure and their father's particular quality of presence. The kind that filled a room without trying. Declan went very still. The color didn't drain from his face so much as abandon it, retreating all at once, leaving him looking like a man who had reached for something ordinary and found something that reordered everything he thought he knew about the world. He looked at the boys. He looked at me. He looked at the boys again. Moon Goddess, he said. Very quietly. Almost to himself. Declan. My voice came out lower than I intended. Controlled. The specific register I used in the clinic when I needed to hold someone's complete attention. Step away from the gate. Walk with me. He walked with me. We stopped at the old oak at the edge of the garden, far enough from the cottage that 3 pairs of sharp young ears wouldn't catch every word, close enough that I could see the doorway and the small shadowed faces I could already sense watching through the window. I turned to face him. He was still working through it. I could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, the pieces arranging and rearranging themselves with the specific quality of someone who already knows the answer but needs a moment to accept that the answer is real. He was young. But he wasn't unintelligent. They're his, he said. Not a question. They're mine, I said. First, last, and entirely. They are mine. Something moved across his face. Not contradiction, recognition. He nodded slowly. How old? 5. The math wasn't complicated. I watched him do it. Watched the moment it resolved. The timeline settling into place with quiet, terrible clarity. Conceived before the rejection. Carried alone. Born into a world where their father had already made his choice without knowing what that choice would cost. Declan exhaled through his nose. Long and slow. The sound of a man setting something down that was heavier than he'd expected. He doesn't know. No. Ilara. Before you say anything else. I kept my voice even and my eyes level. I need you to understand something very clearly. Whatever you're about to suggest, whatever obligation you feel to your brother, whatever Duskmore Pack protocol is telling you right now, I need you to hear me. He waited. I left to protect them. Not from danger. From exactly what you're probably thinking should happen next. I will not have my sons grow up watching their father choose them out of duty rather than love. I will not have them feel for a single day of their lives, like they are the reason someone stayed when they wanted to leave. Do you understand me? Declan was quiet for a long moment. The October wind moved through the oak above us, sending a slow cascade of amber leaves drifting between us like the world making a small comment. He didn't want to leave, he said finally. I went still. His voice was careful. The voice of someone navigating territory they know is mined. What he did at the altar, I'm not defending it. I'm not here to defend it. But you should know that it wasn't what it looked like from where you were standing. It looked like a rejection. It was a rejection. I'm not disputing that. He looked at the oak rather than at me. What I'm saying is that the council had been pressuring him for months. The arrangement with Vespera Thorne, the alpha female he was supposed to take as Luna, had been negotiated without his consent when he was barely 20. Old alliances. Old debts. When he found you when the mate bond, he stopped. Started again. He tried to get out of it. He spent 4 months trying to find a way to break the arrangement without destroying the pack's political standing. And when he couldn't, he trailed off. The silence that followed had a particular texture. Dense and complicated, the way silences are when they contain things that don't resolve cleanly into either comfort or condemnation. He chose the pack, I said. Yes. Over me. Declan met my eyes. Yes. I nodded. Fully. Then we don't actually disagree about what happened. We only disagree about whether it matters why. He had nothing to say to that. There wasn't anything to say. We stood in the dark beneath the old oak for a moment that stretched and then gently released. I'm not going to tell him, Declan said. Something in my chest loosened slightly. Not tonight. Not like this. He looked back toward the cottage, toward the window where 3 small shadows were almost certainly still watching. But I can't promise permanent silence, Alara. Not with what I just saw. Those boys. He stopped. Steadied himself. They are Duskmore Alpha heirs. 3 of them. Do you understand what that means for pack succession? For territorial stability? I understand what it means, I said quietly. I've understood it since before they were born. I'm a wolf. I know pack law. Then you know that this doesn't stay secret forever. I know. I looked at him steadily. But it stays secret until I decide otherwise. Not the council. Not Ashvale Pack Protocol. Me. They are my children and their story is mine to tell on my terms. Declan held my gaze for a long moment. Then he inclined his head. A gesture that was more than acknowledgement. It carried the precise, deliberate weight of a wolf showing deference. Recognizing in the old way that the authority in this space belonged to someone else. On your terms, he said. He left an hour later. No pack escort called. No communication sent. None that I could detect anyway. He walked back to the eastern boundary alone, and I stood at the gate and watched him go and tried to decide whether I trusted him. My wolf said, mostly. Mostly would have to be enough. I went back inside. Nerys was in the kitchen, making a point of being extremely interested in her herbal preparations and radiating the particular energy of someone who had heard everything and was waiting to be briefed. I sat at the table. She put tea in front of me without being asked. A Duskmore, she said. Statement not question. The younger brother. Patrol route. Coincidence. Nerys made the small sound she made when she had opinions she was choosing not to deploy. And he saw the boys. She was quiet. She set down her mortar and turned to look at me fully. In the warm kitchen light, Nerys looked older than her years and younger than her experience. A woman shaped entirely by her own choices, sharp-edged and warm-centered and relentlessly, quietly wise. How long do you think you have? She asked. I don't know. I wrapped my hands around the mug. Long enough, maybe. Or not long at all. Depends on whether he's a better keeper of secrets than his word suggests. Nerys considered this. And if Kale comes? I stared at the tea. The mate bond, 5 years old and officially severed and somehow, impossibly, still present in the way old scar tissue is present, always slightly visible under the new skin, gave one slow, deep pulse. Like something stirring in its sleep. Then he comes, I said. And we deal with it. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing in that warm kitchen on that October evening, was that Declan Duskmore had not technically lied to me. He had not told his brother. But on the table in Kale's study in the Ashvale Pack House, slipped through the mail slot with no name and no message. A photograph. Printed on plain paper, blurred slightly at the edges from a distance shot, but clear enough. Alara Cole standing in a garden in late afternoon sun, laughing at something beyond the frame. Her head thrown back. Her whole face open with it. And climbing on her like she was the most stable and beloved structure in their world. 3 dark-haired, silver-eyed boys who looked exactly like their father. Declan had not told his brother. He had done something considerably more precise. He had let the truth tell itself. I learned later that Kale had stood in his study holding that photograph for a very long time. That the room had been entirely silent. That Vance, his beta, who had been present when the mail arrived and had seen his alpha's face when he opened the envelope, had said afterward that he had never, in 15 years of service, been so afraid of a silence. Cale had looked at the photograph. He had set it on the desk. He had said very quietly, "Get my car." Anne Vance, who was a loyal beta and a practical man and who had spent 5 years watching his alpha be slowly hollowed out by a rejection that had clearly destroyed more than just one person, had gone to get the car. Chapter 4. He came on a Friday morning. I knew before I heard the car. Before any sound at all reached the cottage. Before tires on gravel or a door closing or footsteps on the path. I knew the way wolves always know the things that matter most to them, through the oldest channel, the one that bypasses logic entirely and speaks directly to the part of you that was animal before it was anything else. The mate bond. Dead for 5 years. Severed by his words, by his choice, by the cold finality of a public rejection that had been designed to be irreversible. And yet it stirred now with a violence that knocked the breath from my chest. Like something long submerged breaking the surface. Like a fire you believed extinguished discovering suddenly that one ember had survived. I was in the clinic workroom when it happened. Alone, early, processing the week's herbal inventory before the morning patients arrived. My hands went still over a jar of dried wolfsbane root. My wolf rose inside me so fast and so completely that for a moment the edges of my vision sharpened into the particular hyperclarity of the shift boundary. That thin electric place between human and wolf where everything becomes luminous and dangerous and entirely, overwhelmingly real. "He's here," she said. "I know," I told her. "What do we do?" I set down the jar. I straightened my back. I untied and retied my apron with hands that were almost perfectly steady. "We don't fall apart," I told her. "Not in front of him. Not ever again in front of him." She settled. Not calm, she was nowhere near calm, but contained. Coiled. Ready. I walked to the clinic door and opened it. He was standing at the end of the garden path. Alone. No beta. No pack escort. No Vance hovering a diplomatic step behind him with that permanently cautious expression he'd worn whenever Cale and I had been in the same space. Just Cale Duskmore, standing on Cairwyn ground in dark clothes with his hands at his sides and the morning light doing nothing flattering to the evidence of 5 years written on his face. He looked older. Not badly, not the kind of older that meant diminished. The kind that meant weathered. The kind that comes from years of carrying something heavy and refusing to set it down. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of chronic sleeplessness, a tension in his jaw that had calcified into something permanent, and something behind his expression that I recognized with a clinical precision I wished I didn't possess. Grief. Long-term, unresolved, and entirely self-inflicted. Good, said a small, hard part of me. The rest of me felt it like a bruise being pressed. He saw me in the doorway and went completely still. 5 years collapsed in the space between us like a structure with no load-bearing walls. All that time, all that distance, all that silence, all the mornings I had woken up and chosen to build instead of mourn, and somehow we were back in a version of that same terrible moment. Him looking at me like I was something he didn't know how to hold. Me looking back with armor I had spent years constructing and maintaining and was now feeling the structural integrity of very carefully. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then, because someone had to, Cale. His name in my mouth after 5 years felt strange. Like a word in a language I used to be fluent in. Ilara. His voice was rough. Lower than I remembered and yet exactly the same, and I hated that I noticed. He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't know how to start." "Then I'll start for you." I stepped out of the doorway and onto the path, pulling the clinic door closed behind me. "You saw a photograph. You came here. You want answers. I want too. Those are my terms, Cale. You answer my questions before I answer yours. Non-negotiable." I met his eyes steadily. "How did you find me?" Something flickered. "Declan. He said he wouldn't tell you." "He didn't." "Not directly." A brief pause. "He left a photograph." I filed that away. Declan Duskmore, I thought, was considerably more complicated than he looked. "How long have you known?" I asked. "For days." "And Vespera?" The question landed. I watched it land, watched the particular quality of discomfort that moved across his face at the name, the slight tightening around his eyes that confirmed several things I had already suspected. "The arrangement was dissolved," he said. 8 months after you left. She requested the dissolution herself. Said." He stopped again. "She said she deserved a real mate. not a man whose wolf had already chosen someone else. I absorbed this without expression. So Vespera Thorn had been wiser than the man she'd been paired with. Noted. Why are you here, Kale? The question came out quieter than I intended. Stripped of armor by its own weight. What exactly did you come here to do? He looked at me for a long moment. The morning light was strengthening now, moving across the garden in slow gold increments, and in it I could see every line of his face with an honesty that neither of us had the protection of distance from. I came, he said carefully, because there are 3 children in a photograph who have my eyes. And because whatever I did, whatever I am, I needed to see that with my own eyes before I could decide what to do next. And what, I said softly, do you think you're going to do next? He didn't answer. Because at that precise moment, from somewhere behind the cottage, from the direction of the small back garden where Nerys had apparently, catastrophically, allowed 3 5-year-olds outside before I'd had the chance to brief anyone on the situation, came the sound of running feet. And then a voice. Small, carrying, utterly fearless. Mama, Ryder pushed me and I didn't even do anything. Kane came around the corner of the cottage at full speed, stopped dead when he saw Kale, and transformed in real time from an aggrieved 5-year-old mid-complaint into something that looked considerably more like an alpha assessing a territorial unknown. He crossed his arms. He stared. Kale stared back. And then Ryder came around the corner behind Kane, skidded to a stop, looked at Kale, and went absolutely still in the particular way that meant his wolf instinct had engaged before his human reasoning had caught up. Zale came last, always watching. He came around the corner at a walk rather than a run and stopped a half-step behind his brothers and looked at Kale with those silver eyes. His father's eyes in his father's precise shade, and was quiet in the way he was always quiet. Taking things in. Assembling a picture. The silence stretched. Then Zale stepped around Kane, walked forward 3 deliberate steps across the garden path, reached up with one small hand, and pressed it gently against Kale's jaw. Kale went completely motionless. You smell sad, Zale said. Thoughtful. Certain. The tone of someone reporting an observed fact. Like our mama sometimes smells sad. But different. Something happened to Kale's face. I have spent years working as a healer. I have sat with wolves in the depths of grief and loss and physical agony. I know what a person looks like when something inside them breaks open. I know the specific quality of a face when defenses that have been maintained for years give way all at once. I had never in all of that seen anything quite like what happened to Kale Duskmore's face in the moment his youngest son touched his jaw and told him he smelled sad. He didn't make a sound. But something in his expression shattered so completely and so visibly that I had to look away. I sent the boys back to Nerys with a look that communicated, in the precise shorthand of 5 years of single parenthood, that compliance was not optional. Kane gave Kale one last long, suspicious look before going. Ryder followed, glancing back twice. Zale went last, the same way he'd arrived, watching, assembling, already further along in his understanding of what was happening than anyone had told him. Kale stood very still for a moment after they disappeared around the corner. Then he walked to the garden bench on the far side of the path and sat down. Not dramatically. The movement of a man whose legs had simply decided they were done being asked to hold everything upright without assistance. I sat on the low stone wall opposite. Arms folded. Some distance between us that felt necessary that I was not prepared to reduce. 3, he said. 3, I confirmed. All alpha resonant? From birth. Tamsin, our midwife, confirmed it. All 3. He absorbed this. His elbows were on his knees, his face angled toward the ground, and I could see the muscles of his jaw working through something. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. The question that I had been waiting for. The question I had prepared for, rehearsed for, carried the answer to for 5 years like a stone in my pocket. I looked at him steadily. When? He looked up. When exactly, I said, would you have liked me to tell you? At the altar before you finished? During the rejection to see if that would change your mind? Afterward, in front of 200 people who had just watched you publicly discard me? Kept my voice level. Not cold, this wasn't coldness. It was precision. Or perhaps later that night. I could have knocked on the pack house door. Your door. The door of the man who had just stood in front of his entire pack and chosen a political arrangement over a mate bond. What do you imagine would have happened then, Kale? He didn't answer. You would have stayed, I said. Maybe. Out of duty. Out of the obligation that your pack law would have required. And my sons would have grown up watching their father look at their mother with the specific face of a man who chose correctly but not freely. I shook my head. They deserved better than that. They deserved a father who chose them. Not a father who stayed because he had no other option. You should have given me the choice. The words came out quietly. Not accusatory, there wasn't enough steadiness in his voice for accusation. But they landed and I let them land and I sat with what they meant before I responded. You made a choice, Cale. I met his eyes. You made it at that altar. I just decided not to let it become my children's inheritance. He held my gaze. And something moved through his expression that wasn't argument. It was the specific undefended look of a person recognizing the full weight of a consequence they had spent years avoiding. I was wrong, he said. 3 words. Stripped of everything. Justification, context, the complex political machinery that had surrounded the decision. Just that. I know about the council, I said before he could build on it. I know about the arranged match. Declan told me some of it. I understand the structure you were caught in. Pause. Understanding the trap doesn't change the choice you made when you were in it. No, he agreed. It doesn't. We sat with that for a while. Around us the Carwyn morning continued its ordinary business. Birds in the old oak, the distant sounds of the sanctuary waking up, somewhere down the street a child laughing. Life in its relentless, indifferent, ongoing way. I'm not leaving, Cale said. The words dropped into the quiet with a particular kind of weight. I looked at him. He was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since the night he'd kissed me under a half-moon and looked like he was afraid of something he didn't want to lose, except deeper now. Older. Stripped of the last of the polish. Raw, I thought. He looked raw. Like a wound that has finally been allowed to breathe. I thought about what it would mean. Him here. In this space I had built. Around my sons, our sons, who had his eyes and his bearing and the first stirrings of his alpha nature and had never not once had anyone to show them what to do with it. I thought about Zale's small hand against his jaw. You smell sad. I stood up from the stone wall. You want to stay, I said carefully. Then you stay on my terms. My house, my rules, my timeline. You don't get to arrive here and immediately start making alpha decisions about my sons' lives. You don't get to override my parenting or my authority in my own space. You earn trust, from them and from me, one day at a time with no guarantees and no shortcuts. He stood as well. And for a moment we were closer than we'd been since before the altar. Close enough that the mate bond, that impossible persistent ember, pulsed once with enough force that I saw him feel it too. Saw it in the slight catch of his breath. The micro-stillness of someone absorbing a sensation they had almost given up believing they would ever feel again. Whatever terms you name, he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I turned toward the cottage. Don't make me regret it, I said over my shoulder. And because the universe apparently had a sense of narrative timing, I was almost to the door when Kane's voice floated out through the kitchen window with perfect clarity. Nerys, is the sat smell man staying for breakfast? Nerys' response was serene and immediate. Ask your mother. Behind me I heard Cale make a sound. It took me a full 3 seconds to recognize it because it had been so long since I'd heard it. A laugh. Small. Helpless. I pressed my hand flat against the cottage door and stood still for just a moment, long enough to feel the mate bond pulse again, warm and tentative and achingly familiar, before I pushed it open and went inside. Chapter 5-inch. There is a particular kind of torture in proximity. Not the sharp, clean pain of absence, I knew that pain. I had lived inside it for 5 years and learned its dimensions precisely, the way you learn the layout of a room you spend enough time in the dark. Absence was survivable. Absence had edges you could map and navigate and eventually, if you were disciplined and deliberate enough, learn to move around without stumbling. Proximity was different. Proximity meant hearing his voice through the cottage wall every morning as he talked to the boys over breakfast. Low and careful, feeling his way into their rhythms with the particular patience of a man who understood he was earning something that couldn't be rushed. Proximity meant catching his scent on the garden path and having to stop and breathe through the mate bond's response before continuing. Proximity meant watching Zale climb into the chair beside him at dinner without invitation and narrate the entire day's events with the serene confidence of a child who had decided, in the wordless way children decided things, that this person was safe. Proximity meant Kane's suspicion, daily and deliberate and almost architectural in its construction. The way he watched Kale from across rooms, never quite engaging, never quite retreating, always assessing with those grave silver eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Proximity meant Ryder, who split the difference between his brothers in everything, approaching Kale on the third morning with a small carved wolf he had made himself, crude and lopsided and deeply serious, and placing it on the table in front of him without a word and walking away. Kale had picked it up and held it for a long time. He hadn't known I was watching. He slept in the room Nerys had grudgingly prepared in the extended wing of the cottage, on the clear understanding, communicated with the quiet precision of a woman who had zero patience for ambiguity, that it was a guest room and not an invitation to anything beyond occupancy. Kale had accepted these terms with a humility that I found, despite everything, consistently difficult to dismiss. That was the problem, really. I had expected, had steeled myself for, the alpha version of Kale Duskmore. The one who moved through spaces like he owned them, who negotiated from positions of assumed authority, who had the particular quality of presence that came with leading a pack for years. The man I had occasionally resented across 5 years of solitary nights when resentment was easier to sleep beside than grief. What I got instead was someone quieter. Someone who asked before he touched anything. Who helped Nerys in the kitchen without being asked and absorbed her tight-lipped instructions without complaint. Who sat on the cottage floor with Ryder and Zale and built things from the wooden block set with a concentration and care that suggested he understood the stakes of getting this wrong were considerably higher than the activity implied. Who looked, sometimes when he thought no one was watching, across the room at me or out the window at the old oak or simply at some middle distance that contained things I couldn't see, with an expression that was just quietly devastating in its honesty. I was a healer. Reading faces was my profession. I knew what prolonged grief looked like, what self-recrimination looked like, what it looked like when someone had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had simply accepted the weight as permanent. I recognized all of that in his face. I hated that I recognized it. Because recognition required something from me. Some acknowledgement that the last 5 years had cost him something too, and I was not yet in a place where I was ready to grant that without conditions. So I kept my distance. Professionally, carefully, with the same precision I brought to everything. I was polite. I was measured. When he looked at me with that unguarded expression, I found somewhere else to look. I told myself this was strength. My wolf said nothing. But she was watching. The first real crack in the arrangement came on day 6. It was late afternoon, the boys in the back garden with Declan, who had reappeared on day 2 with the careful energy of a man who had decided to own his choices and was prepared to be useful as penance, and Nerys at her market rounds. Kale and I were alone in the kitchen for the first time since his arrival, and both of us were making elaborate separate projects of not acknowledging this. I was at the bench reviewing patient files. He was at the table with a mug of something I suspected had gone cold 20 minutes ago, staring at it with the expression of a man conducting an internal argument he was losing. He spoke first. I spent 4 months trying to find a way out of it. I didn't look up from the file. I know. Declan told me. What Declan told you? A pause. It was more than 4 months, actually. From the moment the mate bond activated, from the first time I caught your scent on the training field, I knew what the arrangement meant. What it was going to require. His voice was even. This wasn't an appeal for sympathy. It had the quality of a confession, the specific register of someone saying something aloud because the silence around it has become untenable. I went to the council elder 4 times. I argued pack law, precedent, everything I could find. They had documentation. Signed agreements with the Thorn Alpha line going back 15 years. They told me that breaking it would destabilize 3 territory alliances and open our eastern border to challenge. I turned a page in the file. They told me, he continued, that a mate bond was a personal matter. That the good of the pack superseded personal matters. That an alpha who couldn't make necessary sacrifices for his pack wasn't fit to lead it. And you believed them, I said. I believed I had no choice. There's always a choice, Kale. I looked up then. Lovely. That's the part you need to understand. It's not that you were trapped. It's that when it came to it, you chose the path that cost me instead of the one that cost you. And you made that choice without telling me it was happening. You let me walk into that ceremony believing it was our beginning. His jaw tightened. I know. I was carrying your children. The words came out quiet and clean without heat. I was standing at that altar with your sons inside me, thinking about how I was going to tell you that night, and you stood there and ended everything. Without warning. Without giving me any of the information I would have needed to make a single choice of my own. The kitchen was very still. I know, he said again. Lower this time. There isn't a version of that I can justify. I'm not trying to. Good. I looked back at the file. Because justification isn't what I need from you. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? The question sat in the air between us, genuine and undefended, and I found I didn't have a ready answer. Which was itself a kind of answer, because 5 years ago I had known exactly what I needed from Cale Duskmore, with the total clarity of someone whose heart hasn't yet learned to be careful. Well, I need you to be consistent, I said finally. With them. Whatever else is complicated between us, be consistent with them. Show up. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't let them start needing you and then discover that needing you is dangerous. I'm not leaving, he said. You said that on day one. I mean it more now than I did then. I closed the file. I stood up. And because I was only human, only a woman who had loved this man with every unguarded corner of herself and had spent 5 years rebuilding the walls he'd demolished, I let myself look at him for one unarmored moment. He was looking back. The mate bond pulsed between us like a struck bell, resonant and slow and impossible to pretend away. I looked somewhere else. Day by day, I said. That's all I can give you. Day by day is enough, he said. For now. She arrived on day 9. I smelled her before I heard the car. Expensive perfume layered over wolf musk, the territorial scent of the Thorn Alpha line, and underneath it both something that was entirely Vespera's own, cool and precise and carrying the faint edge of someone who had also, in her own way, been wronged by the same set of circumstances. I was in the front garden with Kane, who had finally, on day 8, consented to show Cale the elaborate series of dirt fortifications he had constructed in the garden's far corner. It was not an invitation to friendship. It was more of a formal inspection conducted on Kane's terms, with Cale permitted to observe but not to touch. Progress nonetheless. Cale straightened when he caught the scent. Kane noticed the shift in him immediately, because Kane noticed everything, and looked toward the gate with those assessing eyes. Cale. My voice was quiet. Take Kane inside. Something moved across his face. Elara. Inside please. He looked at me for one moment, and in that moment I saw something I filed away carefully. He didn't look relieved at Vespera's arrival. He didn't look conflicted in the way a man looks conflicted when something complicated he still has feelings for walks toward him. He looked the way people look when a reminder of the worst thing they've ever done appears without warning. Then he put his hand on Kane's shoulder. Gently, carefully, a touch that Kane stiffened at for exactly 2 seconds before remarkably not pulling away, and guided him toward the door. I turned to face the gate. Vespera Thorn was beautiful. I had known that in the abstract. Had known it the way you know things about people who have altered your life without ever meeting you. But knowing in the abstract and standing 3 feet from her were different experiences entirely. She was tall, pale, dark-eyed, with a particular quality of stillness that came from years of Alfrank conditioning, the learned economy of movement that said I do not waste myself on things that don't matter. She was dressed with the kind of understated precision that communicated wealth without announcing it. She looked at me with eyes that were sharp and complicated and entirely without cruelty. That last part surprised me. Elara Cole, she said. Vespera Thorn, I returned. We regarded each other. You're not what I expected, she said. Neither are you, I said honestly. Something shifted fractionally in her expression. The ghost of something that might, in different circumstances, have been appreciation. She looked past me toward the cottage. Toward the window where, I was completely certain, 3 pairs of eyes were conducting highly attentive surveillance. I heard, she said carefully, about the children. From Cale. From my own sources. Pause. I came because there are things you should know. Not for his sake. I owe Cale Duskmore nothing beyond what's already been settled between us. For yours. I studied her face. Tell me. She was quiet for a moment, arranging something. The council knows. Not about the children, not yet. But they know Cale has come here. They know about Kerwin. They have been monitoring his movements since the dissolution of our arrangement because there are succession questions that affect 3 territorial alliances. Her dark eyes held mine. When they find out about 3 alpha-blooded heirs, the pressure on Kale to return to Ashvale, to bring them back to install them in the pack succession structure, will be immense. And the council has methods of applying pressure that don't particularly concern themselves with what you want. The cold moved through me slowly, deliberate as a tide. They'd try to force it, I said. They'd try to make it politically inevitable. She tilted her head slightly. I came to tell you that I can block 3 of the 5 council votes. I still have alliances. I still have political standing, whatever Kale may have cost me. She said it without bitterness, cleanly, the way you state a financial fact. If you want that buffer, you have it. No conditions. No debt. I stared at her. Why? The question came out before I could refine it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, because I spent 8 months as the woman that arrangement required me to be, and I would not wish those 8 months on anyone. Least of all 3 children who had no vote in any of this. Pause. And because whatever Kale Duskmore is, whatever he did, those boys deserve to grow up in the family that chooses them. Not the one that's politically constructed around them. I looked at this woman who had been, in the architecture of my worst year, the shape of everything I had lost, and felt something complicated and unexpected move through me. Not warmth exactly. Not forgiveness for something she didn't actually owe me. Something more like recognition. 2 women looking at each other across the wreckage of the same event, finding something neither had expected to find. Thank you, I said. She nodded once. Brisk. Final. The nod of someone who has done what they came to do and has no interest in lingering in sentiment. She turned to leave. Then stopped. Looked back at me over her shoulder with an expression that was almost dry. For what it's worth, she said. He was completely useless from the day you left. Vance told me. An alpha who can't focus, can't sleep, can't stop staring at the eastern border. She held my gaze for one clean moment. He made a catastrophic choice. But he never stopped knowing it. She walked back to her car. I stood at the gate and watched her go and let the cold morning air move through me and tried to assemble what I felt into something I could name. I couldn't. There was too much of it. I found Kale in the kitchen. He was standing at the window. He had been watching, I realized. Had seen the whole thing from a careful distance. His shoulders carried a particular tension as I came in, the particular brace of a man waiting for something he isn't sure he can withstand. I set my coat over the chair. I stood in the center of the kitchen. She came to warn me, I said. About the council. His expression shifted. I know about the council. I've been dealing with Kale. Not sharp. Just stopping him. I know you've been dealing with it. I know there's a structure pressing on this situation from all sides. I'm not unaware of what's coming. I met his eyes. What I need to know is whether you came here for them, for the boys, or whether part of why you're here is because the council's succession problem made it politically convenient to come. The question dropped into the kitchen like something heavy. He held my gaze. And didn't answer immediately, which I credited him for. An immediate answer would have been too easy. Too rehearsed. Both, he said finally. In the beginning when Vance put the car keys in my hand, yes, both. The photograph and the knowledge of what 3 alpha heirs meant for succession. I won't lie to you. I have done enough of that in the silence of the last 5 years. I waited. But I have been here 9 days, he continued. And I have sat on the floor of this cottage and built things with your sons. And Zale pressed his hand against my face and told me I smelled sad and I had to go outside and... He stopped. Steadied. And Kane showed me his fortifications this morning like he was granting an audience with a head of state. And Ryder put a carved wolf on the table in front of me and walked away and I have been carrying it in my pocket since. He reached into his pocket. Set the small lopsided carved wolf on the kitchen table between us. The council can manage itself, he said quietly. I am not here for succession. I am here because I looked at a photograph of 3 boys who exist because of me and because of you and because of something I destroyed that should never have been destroyed and I physically could not, stay in Ashvale for one more day pretending that any of the rest of it mattered more than this. The kitchen was absolutely silent. The mate bond, that persistent, impossible ember, pulsed with a slow, deep warmth that moved through my chest and all the way down into my bones. He took a step toward me. I stepped back. Not dramatically. Just precisely. With the full awareness of what the distance represented and why I needed it to remain. Don't, I said quietly. Not yet. You don't get to feel this now and have it mean something clean. There's too much between us that hasn't been said yet. Too much that needs to be worked through before. I know, he said. He stopped. He didn't push forward. That too I filed away. I just needed you to know, he said, that whatever I said when I first arrived about terms, your terms, my terms, I meant all of it. I'm not here to take over. I'm not here to rebuild what I broke by bulldozing what you've built. Boss. I just want to be here. In whatever way you'll allow. For as long as it takes. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I picked up the carved wolf from the table and held it out to him. Ryder made that for you, I said. Put it back in your pocket. He took it. Something moved across his face that was too large for the kitchen to contain comfortably. Also, I added, turning back toward my files with the careful precision of a woman who had a great deal of processing still to do. Kane asked Nerys this morning whether you knew how to play Capture the Moon. Pause. What's Capture the Moon? An extremely complicated game he invented himself with approximately 40 rules and no discernible win condition. I opened the file without looking up. He's never asked anyone else to play it. I'd suggest not being busy tomorrow morning. The silence from across the kitchen had a particular quality. Then very quietly, I won't be busy. That night I lay awake for a long time. The cottage was settled into its nighttime sounds. Nerys' steady presence in the room next to mine. 3 boys sleeping the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children who had spent the day entirely, physically, completely alive. Down the hall the guest room was quiet. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum. The mate bond pulsed under my palm. Slow and warm and steady like a heartbeat that had simply never stopped. I stared at the ceiling. He's going to break your heart again, said a voice that was mine and also older than me. Maybe, I answered. You know what's happening. You can feel it. I can feel it. And I closed my eyes. And I don't know yet, I admitted. I don't know if I'm brave enough or foolish enough or both. Outside, the October wind moved through the old oak. The leaves that were left made a sound like pages turning. I didn't sleep for a long time. But when I finally did, I didn't dream about the altar. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't dream about the altar. Chapter 6-inch. It started with a fever. Not the ordinary kind. Not the human variety that meant blankets and cool cloths and waiting it out with patience and fluids. Wolf fever was different. Older. It came from deeper in the body than illness reached, rising up from the place where the animal lived, where instinct and biology moved together in a current that didn't answer to conscious will. When a young wolf's animal nature began pushing toward the surface before the child was ready, before the human mind had developed enough to hold and guide the shift safely, the fever was the first warning. A distress signal from the body's own intelligence saying, something is trying to happen that shouldn't happen yet. Something needs to be held. I knew this. I had treated it in other children 6 times across my years at the sanctuary clinic. I knew the progression, the intervention, the careful balance of wolf medicine and maternal anchoring that could bring a young pup back from the edge of a premature shift. What the textbooks didn't cover, what no clinical training prepared you for, was doing it for your own child. It was 2 in the morning when I heard it. Not a sound exactly. More of an absence of sound. The particular quality of silence that a mother's instinct reads as wrong before the brain has finished waking up. I was out of bed and in the hallway before I was fully conscious, moving on the wolf's older and faster reflexes, and I pushed open Kane's door to find him sitting up in bed with his small hands pressed flat against the mattress on either side of him, his jaw locked, his eyes, silver in the dark, burning with a light that was distinctly, dangerously non-human. Mama. His voice was strained. Controlled in the way that a 5-year-old should not have to be controlled. Something's wrong. Something's trying to. He stopped. His whole body shuddered, one long full-body tremor that moved through him like a current through water. I can't make it stop. I was at his side in 2 steps, both hands on his face, reading him the way I read every patient. Temperature, muscle tension, the quality of the light in his eyes, the rhythm of his breathing. His skin was burning. Not metaphorically. The fever had him already, climbing fast, and under it I could feel the wolf pressing at the surface with the blunt, insistent force of something that had been contained too long and was no longer interested in waiting. Too fast, I thought. He's only 5. This shouldn't be happening for years yet. Alpha-blooded pups sometimes ran ahead of schedule. I had known this was a possibility. Had prepared for it in the abstract, the way you prepare for possibilities you hope won't materialize. Listen to me, I said, keeping my voice completely level. My healer's voice. Calm and certain, communicating steadiness even when steadiness was not what I felt. You're safe. I've got you. What's happening is your wolf. She wants to come out and she's pushing too hard. We're going to hold her back together, you and I. Can you breathe with me? It hurts, he said. I know. Mama, it really, another tremor. Harder this time. His hands gripped the mattress and in the dim light I saw the skin across his knuckles shift, just briefly, just at the surface, into something that was not quite human. My heart seized. I needed Nary's. I needed my kit. I needed. The door behind me opened. He had heard it. Of course he had heard it. His alpha senses were finely tuned in ways that even years of deliberate distance hadn't dulled. And he stood in the doorway in the half-dark, reading the situation in the 3 seconds it took him to cross the threshold. His eyes met mine over Kane's head. No words necessary. He saw it all. The fever, the shift pressure, the strain in Kane's jaw, the faint wrongness of the light in those 5-year-old eyes. And something happened in his expression that moved past fear directly into focused, crystalline calm. Alpha calm. The real kind. Not the performed composure of a man managing his reactions. The genuine, bone-deep steadiness of a wolf whose nature responded to crisis by becoming more itself rather than less. I had forgotten how complete that quality was in him. I had tried very hard to forget. What do you need? He asked. Quiet. Entirely directed at me. Nary's. Wake her, tell her premature shift pressure, Kane, 5 years old, high alpha resonance. She'll know what to bring. He was gone before I finished the sentence. Nary's arrived in under 2 minutes with the focused energy of a woman for whom 2 a.m. medical emergencies were an occupational familiarity. She assessed Kane, confirmed what I already knew, and began preparing the anchoring compound. A specific combination of herbs that worked with wolf biology to ease shift pressure back from the surface without suppressing the wolf itself. A delicate balance. Too heavy-handed and you risked damping the wolf nature long-term. Too light and it wouldn't hold. The compound will help, she said, and her voice had that careful quality that meant there was a but coming. But with this level of alpha resonance at this age he needs more than the herbs, Alara. He needs a bonded alpha pair to anchor him. The kitchen went quiet in the way of things that are already known but hadn't yet been said aloud. A bonded pair, I repeated. Both parents. Both wolves working in sync, creating the anchor field between them. Nary's looked at me steadily. You know this. You've done it for other families. We're not, I stopped. I know what you're not, she said. Not unkindly. I also know what Kane needs right now supersedes the categories you've been managing. From the bedroom, Kane made a sound that was partly a child in distress and partly something older and more animal, and the hair on the back of my neck rose in the specific, primal way it rose when my maternal wolf registered her cub in pain. There was no category in the world that superseded that sound. I turned. Kale was standing in the hallway. He had heard all of it. Tell me what to do, he said. We sat on either side of Kane's bed, Kale on the left, me on the right, with Kane between us, and we followed Nary's quiet instructions and did something I had not done in 5 years. We worked together. Not conceptually. Not in the abstract. Together in the specific intimate way that a bonded pair work together in wolf medicine. Opening the channels between us, allowing the mate bond's connective tissue to carry the anchor between our 2 alpha natures and wrap it around the child between us like a net around something that needed to be held. It required lowering every wall I had built. Not permanently. Not irreversibly. But completely, in the moment without reservation, because Kane's wolf needed to feel the full, unambiguous presence of both his parents' combined authority telling it. Not yet. You are safe. We are here. Not yet. It was the hardest thing I had done since walking out of the Ashvale pack hall. And Kale. Kale was extraordinary. I had known he was a strong alpha. Had always known it. Had felt it in the mate bond from the beginning. That deep, resonant current of alpha nature that was the reason the council had wanted to harness him politically in the first place. But I had never in all the months of our courtship worked with him this way. This close. This open. He was steady in a way that had nothing to perform about it. No effort. No management. Just solid, unyielding presence. His wolf extending itself through the bond channel with a patience and gentleness that I hadn't expected and couldn't look directly at without feeling something move in my chest that I wasn't ready to name. Between us, Kane's breathing began to slow. The fever didn't break immediately, these things never did, but the escalation stopped. The terrible tremors eased. The wrong light in his silver eyes dimmed back to something that was just a child, frightened and tired, held between two people whose combined nature was telling his wolf in the oldest possible language. You are contained. You are safe. You are not alone. It took an hour. At the end of it, Kane was asleep between us. Genuinely, deeply asleep, his small face slack and peaceful, his wolf quieted by the anchor that was still for as long as we maintained it, holding around him. Nerys checked his temperature. Nodded once. Slipped out of the room with the unobtrusive efficiency she brought to everything. Kale and I sat in the quiet. We didn't move immediately. Moving would have broken the anchor, and neither of us was willing to risk Kane's sleep. So we sat on either side of his bed in the small hours of the morning with our son between us, and the cottage silent around us and the mate bond, fully open for the first time in 5 years, breathing between us like something that had simply been waiting. It was Kale who spoke first. I need to tell you something, he said. Very quietly. Not a justification. Not an argument. I need you to hear it and then I won't raise it again unless you want me to. I looked at him across Kane's sleeping form. Say it. He was quiet for a moment. Assembling. The particular silence of a man choosing truth over structure. Over the safe, managed version of a thing rather than the thing itself. The night before the ceremony, he began, I stood in my study for 4 hours. I had the dissolution papers in front of me. The ones I'd had drawn up 3 months before, that I'd been told would fracture the Eastern alliances and open the territory to challenge. And I read them. And I thought about you. About the way you laughed. About the way your wolf went completely still the first time we were close and mine did the same, and I understood exactly what that meant and exactly what it was going to cost me. He looked at Kane. At the small peaceful face between us. I burned them, he said. The dissolution papers. I stood at my study fireplace and I burned them, and I told myself it was for the pack. That a good alpha chose the pack. That the mate bond was, that it was a personal matter like the council said, and that personal matters didn't supersede pack survival. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I want you to know that. I didn't deceive myself. I knew exactly what I was choosing and what I was refusing to pay. I convinced myself that you were strong enough to survive it. That you would move on. That the bond would fade and you'd find something better, and I told myself I would learn to live with it. His voice through all of this stayed steady. But the steadiness had the specific quality of a man maintaining it through an act of will, the way you keep your hands steady when you are carrying something fragile. 5 years, he said. I want you to know what 5 years looked like. Because you deserve the full accounting, not the edited version. He looked up then. Met my eyes across the bed. I haven't slept a full night since the ceremony. The pack bond works, I can feel my wolves, lead them, do the work. But the mate bond gap is it's like trying to function with a wound in a place you can't reach to treat. Some days I managed it. Some days I sat in my study with Vance outside the door pretending not to know what was happening inside. He stopped. The morning after Declan left the photograph. I sat with it for 6 hours. I kept thinking I should feel something complicated about it. Conflicted. Something with layers. He shook his head. All I felt was, I had missed everything. The pregnancy. The birth. 5 years of. He gestured slightly toward Kane. Ryder and Zale down the hall. Toward the full, irretrievable weight of everything that had happened without him. I had chosen correctly for everyone except the people who were actually mine to protect. And I cannot get that back. The room was completely silent. Outside, somewhere in the pre-dawn dark, a bird tested a single note and then stopped. I'm not telling you this so you'll forgive me, he said. I'm telling you because you've been carrying the full truth of this alone for 5 years, and you deserve to know that I've been carrying my half of it too. That I didn't walk away clean. I didn't make that choice and move on. I made it, and I have been paying for it every day since, and I will keep paying for it for however long is necessary, In whatever form you require, because those boys. His voice broke. Just slightly. Just at the edge. He looked at Kane. Those boys are the best thing I have ever had any part in. And I almost missed them entirely. And that is the thing I will never, in whatever is left of my life, forgive myself for. The silence afterward had a different quality to the silences that had come before. Fuller. Cleaner. Like a room after a window's been opened. I looked at Cale. Really looked at him, not the armored way I had been looking since his arrival, reading for threat and managing distance, but openly. The way I used to look at him before the altar. The way my wolf had always looked at him before I spent 5 years teaching her to look away. Weathered. Honest. Sitting with his son's small body between us in the dark, holding nothing back and asking for nothing in return. And I thought, this is not the man who stood at the altar. This was what the man at the altar could have become if he had made a different choice. What he had become anyway, through the specific and brutal education of consequence. I didn't say any of that. What I said was, I know you're not asking for forgiveness. No. But I need you to hear something too. I looked at our son sleeping between us. What you did broke something in me that I thought was permanent. I built my entire life around the fact of it, around the U-shaped absence of it. Everything I am now, everything I built here was built in the space that your choice created. Pause. And I am not willing to unmake that. I am not willing to collapse back into who I was before, into the woman who loved you without conditions and without armor and got an altar in return. I'm not asking you to, he said immediately. I know. I met his eyes. What I'm saying is that I don't know yet who I am in relation to you now. I know who I am without you. I've had 5 years to learn that very thoroughly. But who I am with you, whether that's even possible, I don't have that answer yet. Then we find it, he said. Together. At whatever pace you set. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked down at Kane, small and sleeping and utterly peaceful, anchored between his parents' combined wolves as though this was the most natural arrangement in the world. Do you know, I said quietly, what Zale said to me last week? When I put him to bed. What? He said. I had to stop for a moment. Press my lips together briefly. He said, Mama, our family feels more the right size now. And then he went immediately to sleep as if that was a completely unremarkable thing to say. Something happened to Cale's face that was too large and too unguarded for the room. He pressed his fist lightly against his mouth for a moment. Then he looked up at me with eyes that were entirely helplessly honest. He's 5 years old, he said. He's 5 years old, I agreed. And he is the most perceptive person I have ever met, and I have absolutely no idea where he gets it. A silence. Then, incredibly, in the 2 a.m. quiet of their son's bedroom, with the weight of 5 years and a broken bond and an almost disastrous premature shift all sitting in the room around them, both of us were very nearly smiling. Not quite, but nearly. By morning, Kane's fever had broken completely. He woke up demanding breakfast with the full force authority of a 5-year-old alpha who had been through something alarming and was processing it by pretending nothing had happened. And it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Ryder and Zale, who had slept through the crisis entirely, were at the breakfast table with the satisfied energy of people who had no idea what the adults in their house had been through in the night. Nerys was making eggs. The morning light came through the kitchen window in long clean bars. Cale sat at the table. Kane, who had, without comment, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that it represented any kind of shift at all, climbed into the chair beside him. Not across the room. Not the careful middle distance he'd maintained for 9 days. Beside him. Cale looked at me over Kane's head. I turned back to the bench. But I was smiling. The letter from the Ashvale Council arrived that afternoon. Formal. Addressed to Cale at the Caerwyn Sanctuary in the specific language that meant it had been tracking him, that they had known his location and had waited what they considered an appropriate interval before making their position known. Cale opened it at the kitchen table. He read it once. Set it down. Read it again. Then he looked up at me with an expression that had gone very still. They want me to return to Ashvale, he said. Within 30 days. He stopped. With the children, I said flatly. Yes. I looked at the letter. At the Ashvale Council seal. At the language of political inevitability and succession obligation and territorial necessity. At everything that had been coming since Declan's photograph landed on a desk 9 days ago. I looked at Cale. "What are you going to do?" I asked. He folded the letter. "Set it aside." "What I should have done 5 years ago," he said. Chapter 7. There is a moment. Most people miss it because they are looking for something larger. When everything changes. Not the dramatic moment. Not the confrontation or the declaration or the ceremony with witnesses and lanterns and the weight of tradition pressing down on every word. Those moments matter. But they are not the moment of change itself. They are the acknowledgement of a change that happened quietly in an ordinary room, when no one was watching and nothing was announced. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday morning 6 days after the council letter arrived. I was in the clinic workroom just past dawn, and I was writing my response to the Ashvale Council in the clean, precise language of a woman who had studied pack law for 5 years specifically against the possibility of needing it. Vesper's promised votes were confirmed. 3 of the 5 council seats already moved to a position of non-interference by the time I put pen to paper. Nares had contributed 2 dense paragraphs of sanctuary law that made the council's jurisdictional claim over children born and raised in neutral territory approximately as legally substantial as smoke. Cale had spent 3 days in the extended wing of the cottage writing what I could only describe as the most methodical dismantling of his own council's authority that I had ever seen. Pack law sided against pack law. Precedent against precedent. The specific surgical argument of a man who had governed a territory for years and knew exactly where the architecture was weak. He had slid it under my door on the 3rd morning without comment. I had read it twice. Then I had walked to his door and knocked, and when he opened it I had looked at him for a moment and said, "The 3rd precedent citation in Section 4 is stronger than you're using it. You're underselling it." He had blinked. Then, "Show me." We had sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours side by side and we had built the argument together. Nares had put tea in front of us at some point and neither of us had noticed until it was cold. At one point Ryder had climbed onto the bench between us, surveyed our work with the expression of a small person who has decided that whatever the adults are doing is probably important, and contributed 3 completely indecipherable additions to the draft in crayon before sliding off and returning to his blocks. Cale had looked at the crayon additions. "Do we keep them?" "Absolutely," I had said. And that was the moment. Right there in the ordinary kitchen light with cold tea and legal documents and crayon marks, sitting beside a man I was still deciding about, working on something that mattered. That was when I felt the last wall come down. Not with drama. Not with declarations. Just down. Quietly. The way things that have been standing too long eventually do. Not falling but releasing like a breath held past its usefulness. I didn't say anything. He didn't see it. But my wolf settled into a stillness I hadn't felt in 5 years. The complete stillness of something arrived. The council's response came back in 11 days. Curt. Formal. And beneath the language of political dignity, undeniably retreating. Vesper's votes had held. The sanctuary law precedents had held. The specific and rather elegant argument in Section 4 had held so thoroughly that the elder who had spent 15 years telling Cale that personal matters didn't supersede pack survival had apparently spent considerable time composing a response before concluding he had nothing legally sufficient to say. The letter conceded non-interference. It was 4 lines long. Nares read it at the kitchen table and said with immense satisfaction, "Wonderful," in the tone of a woman who has won an argument she was always going to win but is pleased it didn't take longer. Cale read it standing by the window with his back to the room, and I watched his shoulders drop. Just slightly, just the fraction that meant something that had been braced for a long time was being allowed finally to rest. The boys who did not know the details of what had been decided but possessed the accurate instincts of young wolves in a house full of significant events, celebrated by constructing what Zale called a victory fort in the back garden and what Nares called a structural liability. Kane ran its construction with the focused authority of a small general. Ryder brought supplies. Zale sat on top of the finished structure and looked at the sky with an expression of peaceful satisfaction that was, in miniature, absolutely his father's. I stood at the kitchen window and watched them. Cale came to stand beside me. We stood in comfortable proximity, not touching, not requiring distance, and watched our sons in the afternoon garden, and the silence between us had the particular quality of silence between 2 people who have run out of things to defend against each other. "Ilara. I want to ask you something." Pause. And I want you to know before I ask it that the answer, whatever the answer is, changes nothing about what I've committed to here. I'm not going anywhere. The boys have me regardless. This isn't a condition or an ultimatum. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me. And he had, in the weeks since arriving, stopped managing his expression around me, stopped performing the contained, careful version of himself and simply been whatever was true in the moment. It had become the thing I found most difficult about him. The thing I could least maintain my distance from. He was terrifyingly honest now. About everything. The mate bond, he said. I can feel it. I know you can feel it too. It never actually. I know, I said quietly. I'm not asking you to pretend 5 years didn't happen. I'm not asking you to go back to what we were. He held my gaze. I'm asking if you'd be willing to find out what we could be now. The two people we actually are, not the ones from before the altar. He stopped. I know I don't deserve to ask. I'm asking anyway because I have run out of reasons to be afraid of what you might say, and because Zale told me this morning, entirely unprompted, that I should just tell Mama the true feelings, and I don't think a 5-year-old's counsel has ever been more correct. The last sentence startled a sound out of me, not quite a laugh, something softer. The specific sound of a feeling that doesn't have a better exit. I looked at him. I thought about the altar. I thought about the bus ride north, my forehead against the cold window. I thought about a thunderstorm in July and 3 perfect small bodies against my chest in the most profound silence of my life. I thought about 5 years of building and becoming and learning that I was fiercer and more capable and more entirely myself than I had ever known before the hardest thing happened. I thought about cold tea and crayon marks in legal documents. I thought about Zale's hand against his jaw. You smell sad. I thought about the carved wolf, small and lopsided, that Cale still carried in his pocket every day without fail. I'm not who I was, I said. I know. I don't love easily anymore. I can't do it the way I did before. Without armor. Without paying attention. I'm not asking you to. If you make a choice that costs me. I know what the cost is now, he said. I know it completely. I will spend whatever is left of my life making sure you never have cause to doubt that I know it. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, ask me again. Properly. Something moved across his face, relief and wonder and something that was older than either, and he turned toward me fully and said in the voice I had once loved more than any other sound, Elara Cole. Will you let me try? Not will you take me back? Not will you forgive me? Not the language of before. Will you let me try? I took a breath. Yes, I said. The mate bond, that impossible, unkillable 5-year-old ember, ignited. Not like before. Not the first bright flare of a new thing. Something steadier than that. Something that had been tested by the worst conditions imaginable and had refused to die and was now, given air at last, burning with the specific and irreplaceable quality of a fire that knows what it survived. It moved through me from sternum to fingertips. Cale closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked like a man who has set down something he carried for so long he had forgotten what standing upright felt like. Day by day, he said. Day by day, I agreed. And then, from the back garden, at a volume that suggested the Victory Fort had either been completed or catastrophically compromised. Mama. Ryder says the fort is also a castle and it's not. It's a fort. Can you come and explain the difference? Cale's eyes met mine. Is there a difference? He asked. Architecturally? Negligible. To Kane? Cosmically significant. He was smiling. The real one. The rare one he used to save for when no one was watching. I'll handle the fort arbitration, he said. Good luck, I said. He was already walking toward the garden. The next 6 months did not move in straight lines. Nothing real ever does. There were days when the weight of what had happened between us pressed close and the ease felt fragile, and I caught myself waiting for something to break. Days when an old grief surfaced without warning and I needed space that Cale, to his credit, always gave without being asked. Days when the council tested the boundaries of their concession and Cale's alpha nature and my pack law knowledge converged in the kitchen at midnight over documents and cold coffee and the specific energy of two people who have discovered they are formidably effective together. There were nights when the boys were asleep and Kerwin was quiet and Cale and I sat on the back step under the October stars and talked. Not about the past, not about the future, but about everything and nothing in the way of people who are learning for the first time who the other person actually is. There were mornings when I woke up and the mate bond was warm in my chest like sunlight through glass, and I lay still for a moment and simply let it be good. He kept Ryder's wolf in his pocket. He learned all 40 of Kane's Capture the Moon rules and played the game 3 times a week and lost almost always and didn't once make the mistake of letting Kane win. He and Zale developed a ritual. Every evening before bed, sitting together by the window that faced west, watching the last of the light leave the sky. No words required. Just presence. He learned Nerys' kitchen preferences and stopped transgressing them. Nerys, in return, stopped referring to the guest room as the guest room and started referring to it as Kale's room, which in Nerys' language of deliberate understatement was equivalent to a formal welcome speech. Declan visited twice. He was awkward in the particular way of someone who had done something morally complicated that had nonetheless turned out well, and was unsure whether this entitled him to feel good about himself. I let him sit with the discomfort. It was good for him. Orla, my Ashvale pack sister, my letter writer, my keeper of quiet faith across 5 years of distance, arrived in month 3 with 2 bags and a completely unconvincing claim that she was just passing through. He stayed for 2 weeks. She and Nerys achieved by the end of it a level of coordinated domestic efficiency that was both impressive and faintly terrifying. She held each of the boys for a long time when she first met them, with the expression of someone who has been worrying from far away and is now, finally, allowed to set the worry down. She pulled me aside on her last evening and looked at me for a long time with sharp, kind eyes. "You're happy," she said. "Not a question." "I'm getting there," I said honestly. She nodded once. "That's better," she said. "That's more true." It was Kane who asked about the ceremony. 5 months in, on a morning when the light was the particular clear gold of early spring and the garden was doing its tentative annual revival, Kane looked up from his breakfast with the expression he wore when he had been assembling something for a while and had finally reached a conclusion. "In the sanctuary," he said, "when a pack makes something official, like when wolves join or when mates bond, they do a ceremony." "Yes," I said. "So when are you and Dad doing that?" The kitchen went very still. That, the first time, dropped into the conversation with the total absence of ceremony that was pure Kane. No lead-up, no weight placed on it, no acknowledgement that it was in any way significant. Ryder looked up. Zale, who was at the window in his habitual pre-breakfast sky survey, turned around. Kale had set his mug down with perfect care. He looked at me. I looked at him. "We're working on it," Kale said. His voice was entirely steady. Which was, I happen to know, an act of monumental self-control. Kane absorbed this. Nodded once with the manner of someone receiving a project status update. "Okay," he said and returned to his breakfast. Ryder, who had been watching the exchange with his characteristic grave attention, said, "I want to wear my good shoes." "Noted," I managed. Zale said nothing. He turned back to the window. But I could see, from across the kitchen, the particular quality of his smile. Small and certain and entirely unsurprised. As though this had always been the answer. As though he had known from the very first evening exactly how this story ended. The ceremony was held in Caerwyn. Not in Ashvale. Not in the pack hall with the stone arch and the moonflowers and the weight of everything that had happened there. That space held a story we had already lived. This was a different story. It deserved its own ground. The sanctuary elder agreed to perform the bonding in the old courtyard at the center of Caerwyn. An open space, ringed by the ancient oaks that had been growing there since before the sanctuary existed, open to the sky above and the earth below and the moon that hung, the night we chose, in a fullness that felt like agreement. It was not a large ceremony. Nerys, Orla, Declan, who stood in the back with his hands in his pockets and an expression of careful, genuine relief. Tamsin the midwife, who had been there for the beginning of so many things. A collection of sanctuary community members who had known me through 5 years of building and who had, quietly and without announcement, become the pack that had grown up around me without my planning it. And 3 small boys in their good clothes. Ryder in his good shoes as promised. Kane in his, worn with the expression of someone tolerating formal footwear on the understanding that the occasion merits it. Zale standing very straight with his hands clasped in front of him and his silver eyes moving between his parents with quiet, solemn joy. I wore a dress the color of winter moonlight. Not white. Not the same. Something new. Kale was waiting for me at the altar. A simple stone table set between two of the oldest oaks, dressed with greenery and early spring flowers. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required a ceremony to hold it up. He turned when I came through the courtyard gate. And the look on his face. I have tried to find the language for it. I have turned it over in the months since and reached every time for words that are not quite adequate. Not wonder, though that was in it. Not relief, though that too. Not love, though it was that most of all. It was the look of someone who has been given back something they lost through their own fault and knows, fully without comfort or softening, exactly what that means. The weight of it and the grace of it. The fact that it wasn't earned so much as it was offered. Freely. Deliberately. By someone who knew the cost of offering and offered anyway. He looked like a man who understood down to his bones that he was the luckiest and least deserving and most grateful person in any room he would ever stand in for the rest of his life. I walked toward him. He extended his hand. I took it. The elder began the old words. The bonding words that had been said in this form for 2 centuries, in pack halls and forest clearings and quiet rooms, wherever 2 wolves stood before the goddess and chose each other in the way that mattered most. Not by instinct, not by biology, not by the pull of a bond neither had chosen, but by decision. Clear-eyed and willing and fully aware of everything it meant. When it was Kale's turn to speak his vow, he had written his own. He held my hands and looked at me and said, I once stood before witnesses and spoke words designed to sever. To end. I said you were not my mate, not my equal, not my Luna. In front of everyone who knew your name, I said the most untrue thing I have ever said in my life. Pause. I am standing before witnesses now to say what is true. You're my mate. You have been since the moment my wolf recognized yours, and nothing I said at any altar before this one changed that. It only showed me what I was capable of losing. His voice was steady. I don't know how. You are my equal in every way that matters and in most ways that don't. You are fiercer than I understood and wiser than I deserved and more entirely yourself than anyone I have ever known. He paused again. And if you give me the rest of our lives, I will spend every day of them being the man who chose you. Not because the bond requires it. Not because it is politically expedient. Not out of duty or obligation or the correction of a past mistake. He looked at me with those silver eyes that our sons had inherited, clear and direct and hiding nothing. Because you are the only thing I have ever wanted that I am now, finally, brave enough to choose. I choose you, Alara. Today and every day after, without reservation and without condition. I choose you. The courtyard was completely silent. Somewhere above us, in the old oaks, something moved in the branches. A small sound like the forest exhaling. I had written my vow too. I had written it and rewritten it for 3 weeks, discarding version after version that was either too careful or too raw, too formal or too unguarded, until I found the version that was simply, accurately true. I looked at Kale and I said, I am not the woman who stood at the last altar. She was brave and she was loving and she was not nearly as armored as she needed to be, and I will always be grateful for who she was even though she's gone. I felt him squeeze my hands. The woman standing here has built something from the rubble of what we were. She has raised 3 extraordinary people and built a community and learned what she is made of in this specific and irreplaceable way that you only learn by surviving things you weren't sure you could survive. I took a breath. I don't need you the way she needed you. I need to say that clearly, not as a wound but as a truth. I am complete. I am whole. What I choose now, I choose from wholeness, not from the absence of it. His jaw worked slightly. He nodded. I choose you because you showed up. Because you sat on the floor and built things and learned 40 rules and lost gracefully and earned it. All of it, day by day, exactly as you said. I looked at him steadily. I choose you because my sons call you dad like it's simply the most accurate word for what you are. I choose you because the mate bond was right about you even when you were wrong about yourself. I paused. Let the last part settle. And I choose you because I want to. Freely, with full information, knowing exactly who you are and who you were and who you are becoming. That is the only choice worth making. I choose you, Kale. Not back. Not again. For the first time as who we actually are. I choose you. The elder sealed the bond in the old way. Joined hands, moonlight witness, words in the old tongue that had sealed 200 years of matings before ours. When it was done, when the last words had been spoken and the bond completed, I felt it settle through me from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Full and warm and entirely different from the first time because we were different. Tested. Honest. Chosen. Not broken and rebuilt. Something new, built from the understanding that the breaking had required. From the front of the courtyard, Zale's voice, perfectly clear in the quiet. Is it done? It's done, Nerys told him. Good, he said with deep satisfaction. Cain crossed his arms. Nodded once. The nod of an authority figure confirming that proceedings have concluded to an acceptable standard. Ryder looked down at his good shoes. Looked up. Broke into the widest, most uncomplicated smile I had ever seen on his face. And then all three of them were moving, through the assembled witnesses, cutting a path with the focused efficiency of three small wolves who had decided that the appropriate distance from their parents was now 0. And we caught them all three and held them in the way that you hold things that are your whole life. Cale's arms around all of us. The boys between us, wriggling and laughing and smelling of fresh air and wood smoke and the specific, irreplaceable scent of children who are entirely unconditionally safe. I pressed my face briefly against Cale's shoulder. He pressed his chin against the top of my head. We stayed like that for a moment. Just a moment because 3 5-year-olds have a structural limit on stillness. And the mate bond breathed between us and the oaks stood around us and the spring night was cool and clean and completely, perfectly full. Later. Much later, when the courtyard had emptied and the boys were asleep in Nerys's extended wing, absolutely refusing to be moved home and allowed this on the grounds that the night was exceptional, I stood alone for a moment in the garden of Nerys's cottage. I looked at the moon. It was still full. Still luminous. Patient in the way that things are patient when they have all the time that exists. I thought about the girl in the white dress. Standing in a forest in November with both hands pressed against her stomach, making a promise to 3 lives barely larger than whispers. I've got you, I had told them. All 3 of you. I've got you and I am not going to fall apart. I had kept that promise. Not elegantly. Not without cost. Not without the specific and daily work of choosing, always choosing. To build instead of grieve, to move instead of stay still, to protect what mattered and release what didn't. But I had kept it. Are you watching? I asked the moon silently. The way wolves had always asked, the way the old tradition held. Speaking to the goddess in the wordless language of a lifted face and an open chest. The night air moved around me. Clean and cold and carrying the first notes of spring underneath the winter's ending. I thought it was probably not nothing that the full moon had come out on the night of our bonding. That the oaks had exhaled. That Zale, who had known from the very first evening with his father's silver eyes and his ancient 5-year-old certainty, had looked entirely unsurprised. Some bonds break so they can be rebuilt stronger. Some rejections are just the universe clearing the way for a love that will last forever. And some secrets, carried alone in the dark, protected fiercely, grown into something magnificent, become the light that saves everyone. Cale's arms came around me from behind. I leaned back into him. We stood in the garden together, under the full moon, in the quiet of a night that was beginning something instead of ending it. Regrets, he murmured. I thought about it honestly. The way I did everything now, honestly with full attention without the shortcut of easy answers. About tonight? I said. About any of it. I looked at the moon for a moment longer. Not one, I said. And I meant it completely. Not because the pain hadn't been real. Not because the years hadn't cost me something I would never entirely stop feeling the shape of. But because the pain had made me and the years had built me, and the 3 sleeping boys inside had been worth every single breath of it. And the man standing behind me, arms around me, chin resting on my hair, mate bond warm and steady and entirely real between us, was not the man from the altar. He was better. We both were. That I thought was more than enough. That was everything. The end.
And there it is. A love that was broken, survived, and chose itself back into existence. If this story moved you, if Ilara's strength resonated, if Kyle's long road back felt earned, then this story did what it was made to do. If you've been listening with us today, we would love for you to hit that like button and share this audiobook with someone who loves a story about surviving, rebuilding, and choosing love with your eyes wide open. Subscribe to Wolf Bond Stories for new werewolf romance audiobooks every week, because every bond has a story and we are here to tell every single one. Until next time, The moon is full, and love, when it's real, always finds its way home.